forces at the
briefly in an underpass are moving out again in the direction of the White House.
The White House. Jonathan, you were mentioning earlier what kind of preparations were being made inside the Russian White House. I think I can address that question in that throughout last week we saw them blocking off corridors, we saw them blocking off rooms inside the Russian White House with very, very heavy safes. They were carrying these steel safes to doorways and to strategic locations, and there are armed guards and security checkpoints on the approaches of both Mr. Ruslan Hasbulatov and Mr. Rutskoy's offices, and those guards are very, very jumpy indeed. Anytime we approached them, they came to us with their weapons pointed at us until we showed proper identification. That was also, and they are also used to working in the dark. They have made preparations for working in the dark. They have flashlights. They know that building very, very well. It's a very difficult building to maneuver in. There are, if you know anything about Russian architecture, especially Soviet-era architecture, you will know how bad it can be, and this building is one of the worst designed buildings in Moscow, because in order to get from area to area, you literally have to go up and down multitudes of steps. You have to go down corridors to a new set of steps, then up, then down, then around, and it's very confusing indeed, and it will be very difficult to stage an assault on.
Yeah, Jonathan and Professor Papp, hello, Dan. This is Steve Hurst.
Hey, Steve.
We have been told that they have set up crossfire areas at the end of each corridor where there are stairways and elevator shafts. Two guns pointed in each direction, crossfire that would catch anyone coming up stairways. So if Yeltsin troops should get inside this building, here we've got a motorized howitzer moving down Kutuzovsky Prospect. If they should get inside that building and start moving up the stairways, they're going to find themselves in probably a hail of gunfire. We know inside of that building there are anywhere from 800 to 1,500 AK-47s on hand for people to use. So plenty of firepower, nothing like what we're seeing on the streets of Moscow below our bureau right now, but certainly enough to cause a lot of trouble for anyone who would try to get inside that building. Major gunfire. Sounded like some sort of artillery.
Steve, let me ask you this. Will it be hard, do you think, for Russian soldiers to shoot at other Russian soldiers?
I think it's going to be very difficult, and that's what's kept this thing from blowing up so far, but I think it's reached a point now where Boris Yeltsin has told these people we have got to do something. Obviously, that's what he's doing. The forces are moving on. They come under fire, they're going to fire back.
And let's remind you, too, that Boris Yeltsin earlier this morning at about 6:30 a.m. did say that he had made a last attempt to speak to Ruslan Hasbulatov and Alexander Rutskoy and negotiate a settlement, and that was rebuffed. Let's listen.
Listen to this. Can we have a look at Bruce Conover's picture from the back of the Russian White House and see what's happening there? The gunfire seems to all be coming from that area. We're feeling thuds here a quarter of a mile away from this that would indicate either artillery or rocket-propelled grenades or anti-tank weapons of some sort. We are told from our camera position behind the Russian White House that these APCs had somehow opened fire on the building.
Can you tell from your vantage point whether now the building is completely surrounded?
It's indeed completely surrounded, but we have not a whole lot. You can hear that, can't you? The building is encircled by armor.
see where those shots we're hearing, can you see where they're going and if any of them are striking the White House?
No, we can't. The gunfire and the heavy weapons fire that we're hearing is coming from behind the White House. You have a view there of the first aid station, which is now completely closed off. Before that, pictures of government armored personnel carriers, which we were told had done some of the firing.
Can you see where the main battle tanks went that we saw earlier?
Most of them are still on the street. If we could have Mike Johnson's camera, there it is, looking down. They're still waiting.
I think Professor Papp wants to join us here with a comment.
The one scenario that we may be seeing unfold here is to run the tanks by and perhaps put a breach into the White House. And then if, in fact, behind the tanks, those trucks that we saw had those paratroopers that you spoke of, they might go into the breach caused by the tanks. That's still a downline scenario, though.
Could well be. What we've got, the situation right now is that the White House itself is completely encircled by armored personnel carriers. The majority of the heavy tanks are still sitting below our bureau here on Kutuzovsky Prospect, not moving. There is an armored personnel carrier out in front of them, which is apparently a communications vehicle. Smoke continues to billow from fires. We don't know if they're set by the defenders of the White House or if it's some sort of fire that has hit a truck. The Russian flag barely flapping.
Now, behind those glass windows is the hallway that we've often showed you. That's right outside of the Congress Hall itself, where the Congress of People's Deputies usually meet.
Interesting to note, Eileen, I look down here on the street below us. We see a few people milling about, have gotten up to go about their business on this Monday morning in Moscow and looking for the bus. Where's the bus? A couple of women I can see carrying what is called a perhaps bag in this country, a bag that you always carry just perhaps because you might find something you want to buy. We'll probably not be going far from home today.
We made the point earlier, but it bears making it again. This is a residential area. This is going on within sight and certainly within listening range of apartment buildings where ordinary families are waking up, if they haven't already, and wondering what the dickens is that's going on. Well, what is going on is Russian troops apparently responding to very stern orders given by President Yeltsin for decisive measures to retake the White House and empty the building of the armed men inside of it.
There you can see a Marine standing ready at the roof of the American Embassy. The U.S. Marines have been on alert throughout this crisis. That is the residential section of the U.S. Embassy, those red brick buildings. Now, this firefight is happening literally within a couple hundred yards of that area. Those armored personnel carriers that you saw before approaching and going across, you can see into the right of your screen on that football field. That football field is where the Marines usually play football every Sunday. We tried during the week to cross that field to get into the White House. When access was blocked from the White House, from the government side, there are several positions. If you climb a couple of fences, you can get to the back of the White House.
It doesn't look like there's going to be much traffic into the White House today, Eileen, if it's not inside of one of those steel boxes on wheels. That gunfire you hear is being picked up on the microphone from the camera showing you these pictures. I suppose at this point, Jonathan and Professor Papp, Dan, that we're probably waiting for the next stage to come along in this move against the Russian White House. At this point,
Are any of the vehicles that you can see, Steve, from your vantage point, are they moving? Are they advancing on the building? Are there more vehicles coming down Kutuzovsky Prospect?
The tank column on Kutuzovsky Prospect is stopped, dead. They seem to be loading something onto the tanks. Those are ammunition boxes they're putting on the back of the tanks right now, which you can see in Mike Johnson's picture. But so far, no, there has not been any more advance. We saw, as you reported, some perhaps 8 or 9 or 10 armored vehicles move in behind the White House, which drew all of this fire and the ensuing, we assume, exchange of fire. A number of armored personnel carriers moving along the River Road from the left front of the White House, and they're now parked in front of the White House, although we don't see much activity on the front side. This column of tanks that has come from the west edge of Moscow is now still at a halt about 2 blocks west of our vantage point at the CNN Bureau. We are between them and the White House. Very little movement at this point. A lot of gunfire, but very little movement of this armor.
From where the microphone is picking up most of those shots, it would appear that the worst fighting is happening behind the Russian White House, to the right of your screen, above that football field.
Steve or Eileen, I'm not sure that either of you can do this for us, but find someone who's close to a television set. Tell us what the Russian people are seeing this morning and whether they're getting the same sights we are, the Russian parliament, the seat of authority for the legislative branch of government under attack.
Well, unless this is live on Russian TV, which we don't think it is right now, and unless you're one of the unfortunate Russians who are living close enough to this to watch it, probably not many people know about this. I don't know how far that gunfire would carry, probably a few miles, but certainly Muscovites in general wouldn't know about this. Another pretty good exchange of fire going on from the northwest corner behind the White House. As Eileen pointed out, brief break in the fighting. Alec Moran has been directing our coverage in the control room here in Moscow. Alec, I wonder if you could talk to Bruce and ask him to look at the back of the White House. We might see some damage from the last round of fighting.
As you can see, the armored personnel carriers are moving in that field. That's where they're moving up.
Eileen, we're losing your voice to the sound of the very, very heavy fire now in the streets of Moscow. While we're listening to that, there's also something I'd like you to listen to. I'm monitoring the dispatches from the various news agencies. The French news agency, AFP, is reporting and quoting the Interfax news agency, Russia's own news agency. Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin, it says, issued a final warning Monday to the defenders of the parliament, calling on them to surrender their weapons immediately. This, once again, according to the Interfax news agency. Chernomyrdin is quoted as saying that the government decided to give a final chance to those inside the White House. They must surrender their weapons immediately. The words of the Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin to the last holdouts still inside the Russian Parliament building as it comes under the assault by troops loyal to President Boris Yeltsin.
Well, in his statements asking to negotiate, Mr. Yeltsin had, in fact, again asked that they lay down their arms. In this camera, this is Paul Dietrich's camera, we did see an explosion. The camera's on such long lenses being rocked by some of those explosions. The thuds, very heavy artillery.
I'd like to bring in Professor Papp now. He has a thought he'd like to share with us about what we're watching.
Some of that extended bursts of fire that we heard may have been suppression fire from government forces trying to keep the snipers down on the roof, if in fact that was fire coming from the government forces.
I would say that that was when some of the heavy artillery that we heard, there was some fire coming from the White House. That's a shot of the windows of the White House. As you can see, they had put blinds and newspapers on some of the windows to hide their vantage points. Particularly in Mr. Hasbullatos and Mr. Rutskoy's offices, there were in fact some coverings on the windows to try to hide those places. Mr. Rutskoy last night put a curfew on the White House, as we reported earlier, so that there would be no movement inside the White House. That was because I'm sure that they felt that any movement would make them even more antsy. And as we went through those darkened hallways, it's very, very difficult. We often, as we were staying overnight, we often would come upon soldiers, defenders of the White House, and they would say, stop, halt, and then we would show our identification, and then they would say, proceed, and it would just be a voice from a darkened hall and a light on our identification. Very eerie indeed inside those halls at night, especially when these men thought they would be under attack.
Eileen, I don't know if you're seeing the pictures we're seeing, but there's a group of men there remarkably close to the action. I don't know if they're curious or if they are participants, but they seem to be getting closer all the time.
It looks to me, Jonathan, as if those are maybe journalists. There are a couple of camera bags visible there. Look like some journalists moving in. We saw a flash.
Some of them have
Incredible sounds in the center of Moscow. Listen.
Back of the Russian White House, where most of the fighting is taking place. It would be off to the right of your screen. That's where the bunker is, where most of the artillery and the heavy weaponry that the ammunition and the heavy weaponry that the defenders of the White House have. They had, in fact, stored it in that bunker, although much of it is probably by now inside the White House. When there were thoughts that an attack would take place earlier this week, we saw them always carrying those weapons into the White House, because certainly the White House would be easier to defend than that smaller building, given its difficult architecture. On the roof of the White House, there are snipers.
The Reuters news agency that President Yeltsin's address to the nation is expected very shortly. We will, of course, bring it to you live. We're expecting to hear from President Yeltsin as troops loyal to him and their armored vehicles in great abundance surround the Russian parliament. After 2 weeks of defiance, the Russian parliament is now facing very real weaponry, an assault to end its defiance of President Yeltsin and retake the building that was the legislative center of the Russian government. I want to bring in Professor Papp for just a moment. As we're watching this battle for the legislature, whoever takes that building will control the Russian legislature and the Russian government, but may not end up controlling Russia after this is all over.
That's absolutely correct. The provinces outside of Moscow, out in the outlying areas, a number of them have already, in essence, declared that they're going to go their own separate ways. Whether or not that will, in fact, eventuate, of course, remains to be seen. One other thing I think is worth comparing the August 1991 coup to this operation here. In August of 1991, most of the Russian military stayed loyal to the duly constituted authority, which was Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. Here we have the Russian military staying loyal to the duly constituted president, Boris Yeltsin, once again. So I think we have a case in both instances where the military has in fact stayed with the duly constituted authority, although here we have the parliament being an authority that has been declared unconstitutional by Yeltsin.
But the people inside the Russian White House, I'd like to point out, they say that they are on the side of the Constitution. They constantly say, we're the ones who are in the legislature, we're the ones who are on the side of the Constitution. And that's where a lot of difficulty would also lie, though, because they say they are the defenders of the Constitution.
It might otherwise be a scholarly, academic, constitutional debate. It is being played out, though, as a conflict, a street battle in the streets of Moscow. If you're just joining us, this is live. The battle for the Russian parliament, forces loyal to President Boris Yeltsin, surrounding and preparing, it would seem, for an assault on renegade lawmakers barricaded inside the Russian legislature.
The Constitutional Court was said to be going to meet this morning at 10 a.m. The Constitutional Court, led by a person who was against Boris Yeltsin, had earlier in this drama, about 10 days ago, declared what Mr. Yeltsin did unconstitutional. But then the Constitutional Court did, in fact, back away from that declaration and said that they would consider it again. Here you see armored personnel carriers outside in the front of the Russian White House building.
Yeah, with a red Soviet flag with a hammer and a sickle flapping above them, clearly showing the loyalties of the people inside the Russian White House. Many of them, including now ousted Vice President Alexander Rutskoy, have been calling loudly and longly for a reestablishment of the Soviet Union.
It's also one of the things they've been talking about constantly is power to the Soviets, and what that means is power to the local authorities and the regional authorities. As Dr. Papp pointed out, that therein lies a real problem for Boris Yeltsin. Some of those regional authorities have said that they will declare independence from Russia, and that would mean the breakup of the Russian Empire.
We are led to expect sometime in the near future an airborne assault on the Russian parliament. We are also now told that Russian President Boris Yeltsin will be addressing his country on television at the top of the hour. Our continuing coverage of the crisis in Russia will be back in time for both right after this.
A puzzle. With so many stomach remedies around, how do you know which you can take for heartburn? And for diarrhea? And for upset stomach? You take Pepto-Bismol to relieve most any common stomach problem: heartburn, upset stomach, and diarrhea. So who needs anything else? That is a puzzle. Pepto-Bismol's the only one you need.
Some people are naturally faster than others. In fact, everything they do is fast. Fast, 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 fast. Now, not everyone appreciates that. But if you're looking to get a new GM car or truck financed, fast is exactly what you want.
Mac will take care of your financing.
And the folks who arrange GMAC financing and leasing are faster than just about anyone else. GMAC, the expressway home.
You forgot your sunglasses.
There's no cleaner clean than Prell, because nothing rinses cleaner than Prell shampoo and Prell conditioner. Work. Clean. There's no cleaner clean.
Prell clean.
The versatile Ricoh touchscreen copier. For those impressed by its remarkable brain, consider the body. Precision engineered for heavy duty and high volume. Ricoh's obsession with reliability and performance in a whole new class of machine. And the quality we put into it, you can get out of it right now. Because Ricoh's touchscreen copiers are not only more productive, they're also more affordable. The name to know, Ricoh.
Bimps, Burdams, T-80, T-72 main battle tanks, Russian armor on the streets of Moscow surrounding the Russian legislature. Our extensive coverage of the crisis in Russia continues now with the assault on the Moscow White House, the renegade legislature that has held out against President Boris Yeltsin's decrees dissolving it and against his desire to simply disband and end the crisis in the country. Our coverage continues with analyst Daniel Papp here in Atlanta and CNN Moscow Bureau Chief Steve Hurst and Moscow correspondent Eileen O'Connor in the Russian capital.
Gunfire continues, Jonathan. As I spoke, some more heavy weapons fire. There's a huge plume of black smoke billowing out from behind the Moscow mayor's building, the former headquarters of the Comecon Soviet trading bloc in Eastern Europe. I don't know what that's coming from. There's also a plume of smoke coming from the right side of the building out of a window. There again, we don't know if that was caused by some sort of fire that had hit the building, or if perhaps the defenders of the White House who are also holding that building had started a fire. The gunfire has been almost non-stop for the past 20 minutes, and with a few exceptions, non-stop since about 7:30 this morning. It's nearing 9 o'clock here now. We're expecting Boris Yeltsin on Russian television at 9 o'clock. That would be in about 12 and a half minutes from now. We don't know if that address to the public is going to signal the airborne assault. Go ahead, Eileen.
This is behind the Russian White House. This is between the Russian White House and the Moscow city offices. We've seen some men running back here to this part of the barricade, massing along here.
Clearly assault troops, Eileen, coming out of the hotel mirror.
A couple of them have run by themselves and over and across and into the field that's behind the Russian White House. They may be reinforcements for government troops.
We can say once again, it bears repeating, that the gunfire we're hearing is not very far from these camera positions, but it is obscured. The guns actually firing off those rounds are obscured by trees or buildings that are in the way. This is not a Hollywood movie, and we couldn't put our cameras where we would get the best pictures, but we are bringing you live coverage of an extraordinary event, a battle in the streets of Moscow in a residential area for the legislature of the country.
Yeah, these pictures are being taken by CNN's Bruce Conover, who is in a skyscraper about a half a kilometer away from the White House. Bruce reported to us that some of the gunfire that is coming from the White House has hit that building he's in.
Eileen, I'm just curious about something. Can these pictures, the pictures that we're putting out, be seen inside the Parliament building, do you know?
They did not have, when I was in the Parliament building, they did not have CNN hooked up, but that we did have a live position within the Parliament building, and they knew, at least from that position, what was being filmed. That position is now unmanned because, of course, as this appeared an assault was imminent, that would have been suicidal to be inside that building. Because also, they wanted their messages to be broadcast. They wanted their to be broadcast live. They kept asking us constantly, did this go out live, unedited? As you can see in the smoke, you can see shadows moving in the smoke. Those are men. They appear to be coming from inside the Moscow city offices. Now, anti-Yeltsin demonstrators had, in fact, defenders of the White House had, in fact, taken that building yesterday. But those could be still assault troops from the government side as well. Difficult to tell from here.
Looks to me very much like, Eileen, like as if those are Rutskoy's men trying to get from the mayor's office back into the White House. I don't think that we would have Yeltsin forces out of uniform.
That heavy handgun, small gun fire, our automatic weaponry, the sounds of that would indicate that those were Rutskoi's men as well, because it seemed that that barrage of gunfire came as they were running out as cover for them as they ran into the Russian White House. Now you can see this would be from behind the building, and you can see one man running towards, they will probably run one by one towards the Russian White House. But they have to cross a street which is now covered as well by government forces. So it'd be very difficult for them. You can see the government forces shooting at those men. Rutskoi's men would be on the balcony overlooking this position, as you can see, of government forces. Let's listen.
Conover slowly pulls his camera from that barricade where there are perhaps a dozen or more assault troops who had opened fire on the east end of the White House. I'm told there are about 30 of them now.
As you can see on the upper left-hand side of the screen, that would be a street that they would have to cross the end of that street to get into the White House.
It would look from the pictures we're seeing, and maybe we're not seeing everything, like there really are not that many troops out there. One wonders if this is not the full contingent. It doesn't seem from what they have that they would have enough to assault a building of that size.
Jonathan, there are thousands of troops within firing range of the Russian White House. They're in the Hotel Mir and in locations that you can see on our camera. What you're seeing there is just an initial assault group, about 30 men, who have taken up a position at the east end of the Russian White House. We just a moment ago had 3 or 4 shots fired, seem to have been coming from the Hotel Ukraine, which is just across the street from us here. We're all ducking a bit at this moment.
As you can see, the camera pans by a low white building and then to the red brick building of the American Embassy compound. We repeat again, so as not to alarm people, residences of people, the families in the compound have been evacuated to a gymnasium which is underground, and they are safe. That low building that was next to the Moscow City building has troops who are loyal to Boris Yeltsin inside. Many, 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 hundreds of thousands of troops. We've seen them billeted throughout the week. Those are Rutskoi's men.
These are assault troops, Eileen. Yeah, Yeltsin's people who've broken out of that barricade position are now at the edge of the lawn around the White House.
For viewers just joining us, you are watching the battle for the Russian parliament. Troops loyal to President Boris Yeltsin, it would appear, beginning their assault on lawmakers barricaded inside the White House. The lawmakers refusing to give up their weapons despite several pleas by President Yeltsin and others. The conflict over constitutional power in Russia being decided in the streets by force of arms.
Those were Yeltsin's troops that you saw running towards the White House. It would be above this position as you're seeing right now. These are Yeltsin's troops. Above this position, off to the left, is Rutskoi's men had run out of the Moscow City building. They obviously have not been able to cross that street to get into the Russian White House because they are being covered, of course, with the arms of Mr. Yeltsin's men.
Jonathan, we hear the heavy weapons fire. Hindsight is beneficial at this point. And as you spoke of a constitutional crisis being solved by force of arms, now looking back on it, it seems this was inevitable. Boris Yeltsin, popularly elected and clearly the most popular politician in the country, having been blocked for 18 months on every front by this parliament that stood behind the Constitution that was written in Soviet days and was using that constitutional power to block Boris Yeltsin. The Parliament not willing to give ground, Boris Yeltsin not willing to give ground, and no chance for a political solution. There goes some more of Yeltsin's assault forces up to the east end of the Russian White House.
Two sides, neither willing to give ground, find themselves fighting over the ground right now. Daniel Papp is with us. He knows the area well, and he has a thought he'd like to share.
Well, if in fact we've been hearing rumors that there's going to be an airborne assault, possibly via helicopter, my guess is that what you got to do is get your ground forces up into that greenbelt area where we see the vanguard of Yeltsin's men advancing. If they can get enough people up in there, then we're going to see the copters come in.
The vanguard advancing against holdouts from the Vanguard Party, as the communists used to like to call themselves.
Jonathan and I would remind our viewers we're about 3.5 minutes away from the top of the hour. It will be 9 o'clock in Moscow when we're expecting Boris Yeltsin's address to the nation to be played on Russian television.
At the upper end of the street, you could see men with some riot shields. Those men could very well be Rutskoy's men. They had, in fact, stolen riot shields from buses as they overran riot police yesterday on the way into the Russian White House. They appear to be coming from the Moscow city offices.
Also tell you, we have a 360-degree view from the roof of our bureau here, and there's no sign of anything in the air but pigeons.
We'll also remind you, any assault on this White House will be very bloody because the men inside the White House have vowed to fight to their last bullet, as Alexander Rutskoy put it. Also, it is a maze of corridors and stairwells, and they have taken up shooting positions along every one of them so that they could cross fire. They're hiding behind steel safes and various pieces of furniture. They had piled them up and barricaded themselves into key strategic points within this building.
President Boris Yeltsin has ordered this assault. We are expecting it to be continued with an airborne assault. We are also expecting, in a matter of minutes, President Yeltsin will be speaking to Russia on national television. Our coverage of this crisis will continue with the president's own words when we come back.
It's our biggest sale event of the year. Hurry into Blums on Westheimer and take advantage of incredible savings during our store-wide clearance sale. Save 20 to 50% and more on beautiful furnishings for every room in your home. Now is the time to really save on fine name-brand furniture. You deserve to own the best, and at these prices, you can. Our trained sales staff can help you find the furniture you really want. Right now at incredible savings.
Can you imagine? Only at Blum's Fine Furniture, 5927 Westheimer.
Get the best of Mac Hyford. What you want from a dealer is what's best for you. The best price and service, the best selection too. Cause it's in your best interest to get the best that you can find. You can get the best of us every day and every time. Get the best of us. Cause the best that you can get is the best of Mac Hyford.
The ups and downs of an ever-changing financial world. Minute-by-minute live coverage. The latest from Wall Street, Washington, and around the world. Expert commentary, insightful analysis, and one source can bring it all together. If it happens in business, it happens on CNBC.
When it comes to movies, here's an original idea. Tune in to cable, where the stars are bigger, the stories are better, and the movies are more original than ever. TNT, Lifetime, USA, HBO, original movies. You won't see them in the theaters or the video stores. They're only on cable, where your subscription brings home some of the best movies you'll find anywhere.
Warner Cable. Better TV, getting better every day.
This is CNN.
Devastation.
I know that many of you did not...
A live picture of the battle for control of the Russian parliament. The words now of President Boris Yeltsin on Russian television.
Alarming. This tragic night has taught us many things. We had not been getting ready to make war. We had been hoping that it was possible to make a deal and preserve peace in this capital. And those who began to fight against this peaceful city and unleashed this massacre and bloodbath are criminals. But this is not just a crime committed by individual gangsters or bandits. Everything that has happened and is still happening in Moscow is a pre-planned armed coup d'etat, which was organized by communist revenge seekers, fascist ringleaders, a number of the former deputies and representatives of the councils of people's deputies. Under the disguise of negotiations, they were collecting their forces. They had been recruiting people in their detachments from among criminals. It was just a group of political intriguers, and with arms in hand, they've tried to impose their will on the rest of this country. The means which they were planning to use to rule this country have been shown for the whole world to see. These are cynical lies and briberies. These are stones, these are sharpened rods, submachine guns and machine guns. Those who are wielding the red banners in the streets of Moscow have once again stained Russia in blood. They were hoping that they would manage a surprise attack. They were hoping that their impunity and their unprecedented cruelty would take everyone by surprise. They were hoping that the servicemen would stand aside and would be looking on as the defenseless Muscovites were being dealt short shrift with, and how a bloody dictatorship is being installed in this country. They were hoping that the citizens of Russia would believe in their lies. They were hoping that their victory would come soon. Now they have miscalculated, and the people will damn the criminals. They and those who were giving orders to them will never be forgiven, because they have put in jeopardy their own people, Moscow, Russia, women, children, and senior citizens. This armed rebellion is doomed to restore peace, law and order, and calm troops are being pulled in Moscow. Their objective is to liberate the premises that have been seized by the criminal elements, to disarm the illegal armed formations and neutralize them. I'm asking you, distinguished Muscovites, to give your moral support to the Russian officers and soldiers. They are members of our army and the police. Their only objective as of today is to give protection to our children, to our fathers and mothers, to stop and neutralize the murderers and gangsters. Moscow, Russia as well are expecting you to be courageous and resolved. Public groups that were instrumental in the mass-scale disturbances and other illegal activities are hereby being banned across the territory of the Russian Federation. The Central Bank of the Russian Federation has been instructed to immediately stop all transactions involving the accounts of such public groups. The Prosecutor's General Office has been instructed to immediately start criminal proceedings and start the investigation concerning the fact of organizing mass-scale disturbances. A decree providing for these and other measures was signed last night and is already being implemented. I'm hereby addressing all political forces in the Russian Federation for the sake of those whose life has already been cut short, for the sake of those whose innocent blood has already been shed, I'm begging you, forget things that only yesterday may have seemed important to you. That is internal frictions and differences. Everybody who cherishes peace and calm, everybody who holds dear the honor and dignity of this country, everybody who's against war should now come together and be united. I'm addressing the leaders of the regions of Russia, the leaders of the territories, autonomous entities, republics, and all other administrative entities. Isn't it that the blood that has been shed so far is not sufficient for all of us to understand things for what they are and adopt a clear-cut position based on the principles of the unity of Russia? I'm addressing the citizens of Russia. The armed fascist rebellion in Moscow will be suppressed within the shortest time possible. This country has the wherewithal to do that. I consider it my duty to speak to the Muscovites as well. Over the last 24 hours, there have been deaths in this city. Innocent civilians have fallen victim to the gangsters. Let us pay our tribute to the deceased. At the call of your heart, many of you took to the streets and spent the night in the downtown of Moscow, close to the Kremlin and at a distance from the Kremlin. Dozens of thousands of people were putting their lives at risk. Your civil courage, your will of spirit have been the most effective weapon to contain the criminals. I respect you so much.
Russian President Boris Yeltsin speaking in a pre-taped address to the Russian people, shown as we were watching it for the first time on Russian television. The armed fascist rebellion in Moscow will be suppressed, he said.
Jonathan, as the president began speaking, these T-72 battle tanks that were on Kutuzovsky Prospect moved forward. Two of them sitting on the bridge over the Moscow River. The other 7 have moved down to the riverside. They have taken up positions across the Moscow River with their cannons aimed right at the Russian White House.
Alexander Ruskoy and Ruslan Hasbulatov both could have heard Mr. Yeltsin's address, where he appealed to them not to shed any more innocent blood and to lay down their arms. Mr. Ruskoy had both channels of Russian television on in his office at all times. We saw that throughout this 11-day crisis.
Tell us what we're seeing, Eileen, Steve. We had seen in the last 2 hours armor approach the White House. We've heard a great deal of gunfire. We did see a few troops advancing on the building. Is the assault moving forward from there?
Very, very methodically it's moving forward. It's moved in about 4 stages now. First of all, we saw a number of APCs, armored personnel carriers, drive into the back of the White House a couple of hours ago. That was followed on by these tanks that moved up Kutuzovsky Prospect, but stopped about a mile short of the White House. They have now moved up. That was the 4th step. And in between the 2nd and 4th, assault troops have moved out of the Mir Hotel across the street, the east end of the White House, and are moving on the building. We saw some pictures earlier of some pieces of the Russian White House crumbling away, having been hit by shell fire of some sort.
We were led to expect, I believe, by officials in Moscow that there would be some kind of airborne assault on the building. Any sight of that now?
None yet, but I think we should add at this point that we're talking about what the Russian Army calls desantniki, which those are paratroopers, but they needn't necessarily come in by air. They could be on the ground. These are crack troops, commando troops who could do that. The picture you see now, we saw gunfire coming out of those windows.
Many of the windows had been prepared and covered up by blinds and newspapers, clearly preparing holes from which to shoot from.
If you're just joining us, this is the battle for the Russian White House, the legislature where hardline lawmakers have held out against President Boris Yeltsin's decree dissolving the legislature, and since then, pleas asking them to surrender. They have not surrendered. They are now barricaded inside their building and facing an assault by the Russian army that is now getting underway.
Seeing a picture right now of 2 T-72 battle tanks that have pulled onto the bridge over the Moscow River. 7 other of those tanks have gone off to the left of this picture, taking up positions with their cannons pointed right at the Russian White House across the river, clearly within easy range. We have seen no fire from those tanks yet. Those tanks began moving into their present position exactly as Boris Yeltsin began to speak.
Boris Yeltsin apparently apologetic, it would seem, about his earlier statements that there would be no bloodshed in this dispute. He told Russians, "We had not been getting ready to make war. We had tried to preserve the peace in this capital." As we are seeing in this live picture from Moscow, there is no peace in the capital right now. In the heart of a residential area, the legislature is under a very fierce attack. It's a city of 9 million people. Most of them, of course, are very far away from the action that's unfolding now, but this is a historic and very significant place in that city. It is the seat of the legislature, now being attacked by Russian troops.
And lest anyone doubt that this is a full-fledged attack on the White House, Jonathan, there are dozens of armored vehicles ranged around the White House. And going back to your statement about Boris Yeltsin sounding apologetic, he has spent now 14 days having not shot from his side in anger. Okay, we can see men going into the Russian White House now. Apparently assault troops. Pictures are brought to you.
Now again, what they find inside will be heavily fortified corridors and rooms. Men inside had AK-40, had assault rifles and had automatic rifles, and they were hiding behind safes and barricades that they had constructed. They also have a lot of food supplies in there, a lot of ammunition supplies.
They have women and children and prisoners as well, according to some reports.
There's certainly women and children, Jonathan. The women and children were part of the demonstrators, and they probably went inside when some of the shooting started. I've spoken to numerous elderly people, men and women, and there was one small child, a 4-year-old girl named Natasha, whose grandmother, both of her grandmothers, had taken her there, and she was there throughout those 14 days. She was sleeping outside with them under a makeshift shelter. Can only wonder where she is right now.
Picture of a T-72 battle tank with its cannon and machine gun, both pointed towards the White House. We haven't seen it fire yet.
From all of this gunfire, I'm wondering why we aren't seeing more damage to the building.
Well, we did, in fact, see some damage to the building when it was heavily hit. A lot of this gunfire, as we've said, is going on around this bunker, which is behind the Russian White House and covered and obscured by trees. It's a lower building, and so therefore, in the earlier assault, certainly that was what was being hit.
Jonathan, I will also suggest that mostly what we have heard has been small arms fire, punctuated by heavier fire. It's not clear who's shooting what from our vantage point, but I have a feeling that there's a lot of exchange of gunfire from the Russian side, the Yeltsin side, shooting at windows where, no doubt, the Rutskoy people are firing back.
I suppose we should be looking for smoke or gas to emerge from those windows. That seems to me something they might want to do at this point.
President Boris Yeltsin flushed the hardliners out. Dozens of people were reported killed. The United States is sending more troops to Somalia following the deaths of 12 U.S. soldiers and a Malaysian peacekeeper in Mogadishu. Somalis danced among the wreckage of the city. Former Parliament Chairman Ruslan Hafizbulatov and the former Vice President Alexander Rutskoy surrendered following the 10-hour attack on the Russian White House that reportedly killed dozens of people. CNN's Christiane Amanpour is in Moscow and joins us with the latest. Good morning, Christiane.
Good morning to you, Susan. Indeed, the violent showdown is now all but over, but the shooting has not completely stopped. We've heard reports tonight of a gun battle outside the ITAR-TASS news agency. ITAR-TASS reports that one person was killed in that battle. We've also heard from the Interior Ministry that some 200 rebels that were inside the White House, inside the Parliament building, may have fled with their weapons and are holed up somewhere in the center of Moscow. We've heard quite a lot of sporadic firing and shooting despite the 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. curfew. We're told that those troops may be holed up, as I say, firing, trying to flee out of the city and into the hinterlands. The death toll from today's violence is not yet known. It could go higher than expected. Once people go into the White House tomorrow and find out the extent of the damage and find out more bodies may be in there. As you see now from our live picture, the building is still burning some 24 hours after the assault was launched. Flames are spreading, the fire is spreading in all directions. We get more now on the details of this extraordinary day from CNN's Walter Rogers.
The Russian parliament burning, set on fire as the Russian army was called to suppress an armed revolt led by hardline opponents trying to overthrow President Boris Yeltsin. A T-80 tank fires another 125-millimeter shell point blank into the building where several hundred anti-Yeltsin rebels made their last stand. There was war on the streets of Moscow as small arms fire rattled throughout the city. Anyone near the Parliament building was in a free fire zone, and there were heavy casualties inside and outside of the building. Snipers on the roof of Parliament sent many scurrying. And some gunmen found their targets. This man crawls to the aid of a friend, felled by the heavy sniper fire. During periodic lulls in the fighting, a makeshift morgue was arranged on a sidewalk. A total casualty count may not be known for days. Slowly, groups from inside the Parliament surrendered, and little mercy was shown after the worst civil strife Russia has seen since the Bolshevik Revolution. Police who went over to the rebels when they believed the tide was shifting against President Yeltsin were treated with contempt. In his address to the nation, Russia's president vowed to crush those like Vice President Alexander Rutskoy, who he holds responsible for the revolt.
They and those who were giving orders to them will never be forgiven because they have put in jeopardy their own people, Moscow, Russia.
Yeltsin was clearly talking about the hardline leader of the rebels, former Vice President Rutskoy, who Sunday called on a mob to storm the television center at Ostankino. Sunday night, that anti-Yeltsin mob, including communists, Russian nationalists, and discontents, stormed the TV center, provoking a ferocious battle that claimed at least 20 lives before the TV building was safely back in government hands. The loyalty of the Russian army, and specifically Defense Minister Pavel Grachev, has been Mr. Yeltsin's trump card throughout this crisis. Without army support, this country could have been sunk into another horrible civil war. 24 hours after their call to revolution, Russia's hardliners carrying a white flag emerged from the parliament they earlier vowed to defend to the last shot. Russian television showed these pictures of former Vice President Rutskoy and Parliamentary Speaker Khasbulatov, leaders of the revolution, under arrest. But their incarceration has not silenced the guns. At dusk, tracer fire still lit up the Moscow sky, and pockets of snipers vented their lethal anger on passing cars, pedestrians, as well as the army still patrolling the streets. Walter Rogers, CNN, Moscow.
Christian, we just heard Boris Yeltsin saying that Rutskoy and Khasbulatov will never be forgiven, but the question is, will they be prosecuted? And if so, how will that happen?
Well, Susan, we're not exactly sure. We've been reading reports tonight that say the two who are in jail will presumably have to be charged, if they're going to be charged, by Thursday night, according to the rules of justice here. We heard a report tonight, an aide of President Yeltsin was talking to a Russian press saying that Russia is a great, kind, and gentle country and forgives most sins, but not the sin of treason. Does that mean these two hardliners will be charged with treason? We don't know that yet. We'll have to wait and see. Now, the two hardliners were holed up, as you know, for many days, 13 days, inside the White House, inside the parliamentary building. On their last day, they stared defeat in the face. They were frantic. CNN's Claire Shipman reports on their last hours in the White House.
From the outside, the shocking and now familiar sight of Moscow on fire. But not many were privy to the compelling drama inside the Russian White House. Alexander Rutskoy, vice president and now prisoner, in the midst of the attack Monday, making a desperate appeal that he hoped would be heard. Help us, he cried. We have wounded women and children. They can't get out. I'm calling on all military men, pilots. Come to the White House. We're being killed. Parliament Chairman Ruslan Khasbulatov reacted in the opposite way, seeming to be in a different world. This amateur video, unsteady, perhaps as the nerves of the cameraman, shows eerie, dark hallways, with most hunkered down away from the gunfire, looking for places to hide. But there was no hiding from the reality outside. It's not clear how many of those inside ended up heaped outside of the White House later. Estimates range from 20 to hundreds dead. The special government forces that moved in were told only to fire if fired upon. But the group of Parliament defenders had grown more determined as conditions had worsened in recent days. Rutskoy and his men had promised they would fight. They kept their word. This doctor vents his anger and sorrow at some of the captured Parliament guards, blaming them, not Yeltsin, as the instigators of the rampant violence that cost so much life. This medic says he saw dozens of women come out of the White House, and children too, but none of them hurt. Of course, that help from Rutskoy's fighter pilot buddies never came, and Ruslan Khasbulatov and Alexander Rutskoy, according to government sources, have been taken, perhaps meaningfully, to Lefortovo prison, the political prison of choice in the days of Joseph Stalin. Claire Shipman, CNN, Moscow.
You're looking right now again at a live picture of the scene outside the Russian White House. To the left of your screen in the background, the illuminated building is the White House, still burning. In the foreground, you have the road and the bridge leading in front of the White House, and to it, perhaps there in the distance, you can just pick out 4 tanks that are blocking this side of the bridge, blocking all traffic and certainly all people from going anywhere near there. Now, the curfew has just been lifted. It was lifted 10 minutes ago. So far, the streets outside in this vicinity are quiet. We'll just have to wait to see how this day progresses. As that fire burns, President Yeltsin has been reeling in more support. We've heard that he's gotten a lot of support from the regions who back Monday's move, Monday's crackdown against the hardliners in the White House. And indeed, when we were out on the streets just before the 11 p.m. curfew, we saw many bands, dozens of pro-Yeltsin supporters in the streets, forming their own little brigades, supporting him, chanting his name, and cheering his troops as they came and went. We may indeed hear from President Yeltsin, televised address tomorrow. His foreign minister told Secretary of State Warren Christopher that the president may speak in order to reaffirm his commitment to free elections, in order to reaffirm his commitment to the course of democracy. However, we must add that that course of democracy has come at a very high price. A lot of blood has been shed, and President Yeltsin has cracked down on some of the political parties, the hardline Nationalist Party. He's banned again the Russian Communist Party, and he's closed down some of those organizations' press instruments, their mouthpieces. I'm Christiana Manpour, CNN, reporting live from Moscow.
The world continues to keep a close watch on the upheaval in Russia.
Just ahead, we'll tell you what President Clinton and others have to say about the crisis.
And later, we'll tell you how many Americans are now living in poverty. Stay with us.
Russian President Boris Yeltsin continues to have the support of the Clinton administration as long as Mr. Yeltsin keeps his country on the road to democracy. President Clinton says he is following the crisis in Russia closely while he continues his 3-day swing through California. In a speech to labor leaders in San Francisco, Mr. Clinton made it clear U.S. support was based on Mr. Yeltsin's promises to push ahead with democratic reforms. He says Mr. Yeltsin did what he had to do to restore order in Moscow.
The United States continues to stand firm in its support of President Yeltsin
because he is Russia's democratically elected leader. We very much regret the loss of life in Moscow, but it is clear that the opposition forces started the conflict and that President Yeltsin had no other alternative than to try to restore order. It appears as of this moment that that has been done, and I have as of this moment, absolutely no reason to doubt the personal commitment that Boris Yeltsin made to let the Russian people decide their own future.
Secretary of State Warren Christopher echoes Mr. Clinton, saying U.S. support for the Russian leader depends on his path toward democracy. Christopher says he has spoken with Russia's foreign minister, who gave some indication as to what Mr. Yeltsin's next move might be.
He indicated that Yeltsin would probably be making a speech tomorrow in which he would reaffirm his intention that there'd be elections, that they'd be open and free elections, I think the 11th and 12th of December, and also indicate the intention to have a presidential election later on. In short, to give reassurance that he was still on a democratic course.
A U.S. State Department spokesman says Christopher will visit Russia later this month to promote stability and continuity in U.S.-Russian relations. Still ahead on World News, the World Trade Center bombing trial gets underway in New York. We will